All right, hi everybody. Welcome, thank you for being here. Please, enjoy your lunch. We in the African American Studies Department believe in nourishing people intellectually and in terms of basic sustenance. We can't expect you to pay attention to the rigor and brilliance you're about to absorb without a full, or at least a semi-full stomach. So welcome, we're glad that you're here. And welcome to the spring semester of the Band Scholars Project here in the African American Studies Department at UC Berkeley. All right, so far as I know, there is no forthcoming executive action criminalizing about what I'm about to do, but let's go for it. Okay, so we're joining you today from the campus of UC Berkeley, sited on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. We acknowledge and pay respect to the Muwekma Ohlone ancestors, people today, and the Muwekma Ohlone future to come. One way to make concrete such acknowledgements is through the payment of Shumi land tax, a material way for non-Indigenous people living in the East Bay to participate in the rematriation of land to Indigenous people. With this in mind, the Department of African American Studies has begun practice of giving Shumi quarterly to the Indigenous-led Sogoreté Land Trust, an urban land trust founded in 2012, with the goal of returning traditionally Chochenyo and Karkan lands in the San Francisco Bay Area to Indigenous stewardship and cultivating a more active reciprocal relationships with the land. You can find more about the information about this. Hi, welcome everyone. On Shumi land tax at sogoretelandtrust.org. Let me just start with a set of thank yous, then I'll launch into an introduction here, which is to begin with, to thank Charisse and Jody, who I'll introduce in a moment, for being our Band Scholars Fellows. I want to thank the Social Sciences Matrix and Eva Cito in particular for hosting us, along with our co-sponsors in Gender and Women's Studies, Ethnic Studies, the Center for Race and Gender, and the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. And we also want to thank our comrades at Pegasus Books, my beloved local bookstore, who will sell you a copy of Organized Fright Win outside. Thank you to the Department of African American Studies, it goes without saying, helmed by our chair and leader, Professor Eula Taylor. And the incredible staff support from Sandy Richmond, Lindsay Villarreal, and Maria Herrera. I want to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Spencer Foundation for their financial support of this grant project. And most importantly, we need to thank the indomitable organizing talents of Barbara Montano, without whom I am the first to tell you none of this would be happening. And I would also like to call your attention to the fact that this is just one of several events that the Band Scholars event project is happening. They're going to make an appearance at Berkeley High School tomorrow, which has been part of what we've been doing. Like, all of our Band Scholars have paid visits to Berkeley High School, which have been, I'm sorry, none of you get to come to this, but I've been to them before and they're fantastic. Sending brilliant people like this to go talk to Berkeley High School students is a genius move that we have, I think, the innovation from the people in the department, in particular, to the Black Studies Collaboratory, who built that combination, to thank for that project. It's really outstanding. But then this Thursday, February 13th, starting at 6:30 at the Eastside Arts Alliance, which is out on the International Boulevard in Fruitvale, there's an event, Organized Fight Win Beyond the Election Cycle, that will feature Charisse and Jody and Rupa Maria and Stephen Osuna in what really is designed to be a kind of social movement conclave, a sort of gathering of social movement organizers. So if that's you, if you have an interest in that, please do come. This promises to be an outstanding event, and we will also feed you there as well. Okay, so my name is Michael Marcohen. I'm an associate teaching professor here in African American Studies and American Studies, and I'm the co-director of the Band Scholars Project, along with my fabulous colleagues, Eula Taylor, Nikki Jones, and Tiana Pichel. Funded by a generous grant from the Mellon Foundation and the Spencer Foundation, the Band Scholars Project was inspired by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' claim in a speech announcing the banning of DEI programs and ethnic studies projects in Florida higher education in 2023. That students interested in critical race theory and gender studies should, in his words, quote, go to Berkeley. While we appreciate the governor's endorsement of our campus and its longstanding and ongoing influence in these fields, DeSantis's compliment was clearly a threat, promising an expanded attack on public education and on an educated public by first attacking the study of race, gender, and sexuality in public universities. When the Banned Scholars Project first began, we were monitoring the expansion of DeSantis's war on woke as it spread from Florida to Texas and Utah, Tennessee, Indiana, and elsewhere before finding a prominent place in the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. Since then, well, you all know what is coming out of Washington: renewed imperial bluster enforced by a fixed gender binarism and banning DEI, while blaming diversity initiatives and hiring from everything for plane crashes to wildfires. What we are witnessing amounts to more than a Wilsonian resegregation of the federal workforce, but marks an explicitly hegemonic restoration of imperial white supremacy as a national project. Meanwhile, watching this rising tide of fascist stupidity, many of us anxiously wait for the shoe to drop, wondering when and how this war will, as DeSantis promised, go to Berkeley. In the face of this obvious existential threat, not just to our specific fields, but to the entire project of academic freedom and free speech at the public university, our campus leadership has remained entirely and inexplicably silent, if not backhandedly silencing. You see why I am a soldier in Eula Taylor's army? Okay, anyways. They offer no response to Trumpism, whether rhetorical, legal, or practical. Instead, they quietly offer us kindly advice to keep our heads down, watch what you say in your public programming, and even helpfully suggest that maybe if you just tone down the Marxism and embraced the Palestinian exception, you might not invite any unwanted attention from them. As if all of our enemies were somehow exclusively coming from off campus. If our campus leadership cannot or will not show a fundamental commitment to defending the public purpose and public good of the public university, let alone free speech and academic freedom, then it must come from us. It always has and always will come from us. After all, it is we, principally the inhabitants of the 5th and 6th floor of this building, who do the research, teaching, and mentorship in these dangerous and now increasingly banned fields. And if you think that that sounds like hyperbole, just look what's happening in North Carolina right now. We believe, as this grant affirms, that to be a part of the public university must be to defend the public university, and that it is our common responsibility to advocate for our students, to defend the diversity of our staff and faculty, and to stand for the greater civic good embodied in African American studies and public higher education in general. The Banned Scholars Project is an attempt to push back against these divisive, racist, sexist, homophobic, and transphobic state and now federal policies with the strongest weapon available to us as scholars: solidarity. And so we have been committed to inviting scholars from around the country who are facing that threat directly in their classrooms, with their students, and in their daily experience as activists and educators. Today, we welcome to what amounts to our final Banned Scholars Fellowship, Jody Dean and Charisse Burden-Stelly. And while they may be the last of such residences, they and their message they bring, organize, fight, win, arrives just in time. Together, Jody and Charisse are the authors and organizers, editors of Organize, Fight, Win, buy your copy outside, Black Communist Women's Political Writing, published in 2022 by Verso. Organize, Fight, Win collects more than 40 works by more than 24 Black communist women, ranging from well-known figures like Lorraine Hansberry and Ella Baker to those whom this collection revives and reintroduces, like Grace Campbell or Louise Thomas Patterson, who, like Charisse, has a degree from Cal. I can't think of a collection from and on the American left in such desperate need of recognition and revival as this group of women whose very existence and work theorizes, historicizes, and organizes against what they call the triple threat, or excuse me, the triple exploitation experienced by working class Black women radicals. The goal, Jody and Charisse write, was building collective power capable of winning the struggle for freedom, and nothing less than that. Charisse Burden-Stelly received her PhD in African Diaspora Studies here at UC Berkeley. And we are immensely proud to invite her back. Well, we're on the 8th floor, but to invite her back to the 6th floor, the sovereign maroon community of the 6th floor of Social Sciences Building. She has held a sequence of prestigious postdocs and fellowships and is currently an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit. She's the author of 2 books, and I have, if you know anything about me, I have props. She is the author of 2 books, Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States, published in 2020. Oh, and there's the family. and there's the family. Like, welcome. That's delightful. Okay. She's also co-authored with the indomitable Gerald Horne, a biography of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, published in 2019. A major public intellectual, her work and organizing has appeared all over in academic and public-facing journals, and she has been on damn near every podcast and YouTube channel worth listening to, including The Dig, which is my personal favorite. And to single out but one such piece, I would call your attention to her headline essay in the July 2020 issue of Monthly Review on U.S. racial capitalism. For those of you who don't know, Monthly Review is the oldest continually published socialist journal in U.S. history and proof that Charisse and her work represents the future of fighting racial capitalism in the United States. Jody Dean is a professor of politics at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. She is the author and editor of more than a dozen books on political theory and cultural studies. Just to cite a few and to let you know that I am an OG Jody Dean fan, I give you Aliens in America, Conspiracy Culture from Outer Space to Cyberspace from 1998. More recently, Jody is the author of a trilogy of books from Verso, The Communist Horizon, Crowds and Party, and Comrade, which offers the helpful reminder that, quote, anyone, but not everyone, can be a comrade. And while Charisse and Jody's work take up the topics of banned knowledge and banned ideas, in April 2024, Jody formally entered the ranks of a banned scholar when she was removed from her teaching responsibilities for a post she authored on the Verso blog about Palestinian resistance. She has since been restored to these teaching duties and is now the author of another new book coming out in March entitled Capitalism's, and she has a prop, Capitalism's Grave, Neo-Feudalism and the New Class Struggle. So please join us in welcoming Jody Dean and Charisse Burden-Stelly.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thank you all so much for the very warm welcome. I know it's a coming home for Charisse, and it's a new encounter for me, but I felt completely at home and welcome, so thank you all so much for the great hospitality. We'd like to begin by reading the names of our authors. This is primarily because this is their book. We're just making sure that people read it and know about their contributions. Ella Baker, Charlotta Bass, Dorothy Burnham, Williana Burroughs, Grace P. Campbell, Alice Childress, Marvel Cook, Esther Cooper Jackson, Thelma Dale Perkins, Tyra Edwards, Vicki Garvin, Yvonne Gregory, Lorraine Hansberry, Dorothy Hunton, Claudia Jones, Maud White Katz, Louise Thompson Patterson, Eslanda Good Robeson.
And that is who's playing. All of them are in the background, as you can see. There's biographical information about the women in this book. And so there are so many things that we could say about organized fight when, but we thought we'd focus initially on the sort of scholarly contributions. First of all, I think it's important that we publish this book with Verso because we wanted it to not only have resonance within academia, but to also circulate within our own organizing circles and for public intellectuals, organic intellectuals, and people who don't have formal education. And the politics of publishing, there's all sorts of politics of publishing, specifically when you publish with university publishers. And so doing it with Verso, before their union busting, we published this with Verso. I want to live that up. But so first is the contribution to Black studies. So I am classically trained in the field of African American, African diaspora studies. And even though, you know, Black Studies has this movement foundation, I still didn't learn about these people. I didn't learn about very many communists. There was W.E.B. Du Bois here and there, but, you know, we read Souls of Black Folk. I didn't even know he joined the Communist Party till I did my own research. There was some about Paul Robeson, some aspects of Lorraine Hansberry, predominantly her cultural production. And so I think that this book is really important to Black Studies because it really conveys the ways that Black women understood themselves as class subjects, as racialized subjects, and as and the way their sex contributed to both their exploitation and oppression. It's also important because, like Black Studies, it also lifts up the different sites of knowledge production. So these women didn't write monographs, but they did write committee reports. They wrote speeches. They wrote critiques. And they also produced theory in theoretical journals. And so like Black Studies, which really fundamentally challenged in the 60s and beyond who counts as a knowledge producer, so too does this book, I think, expand our understanding of what it means to be a knowledge worker and who gets to theorize the world in which we live, and then subsequently what we are to do about it.
And we also think of the book as a contribution to women's studies and gender studies. One of the things we've been reflecting on over the last couple of days is how many courses across the country, like Introduction to Women's Studies, use Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class, and yet nobody seems to remember the chapter on communist women.
Chapter
Right?
10.
Yeah, and it's a really strange phenomenon once you start pointing out, everyone reads this book, but they ignore the communist women part. And we think that it's really crucial to make very clear the communist organizing work of these Black women, that they were organizing within and adjacent to the Communist Party during periods of repression, particularly the McCarthyite period, which we will talk more about. And so it takes an incredible amount of bravery, right? They're suffering all kinds of surveillance and FBI persecution, having loved ones in prison, as Claudia Jones, of course, being deported. So we wanted to make sure to bring into women's studies the contribution definitely of Black women, and definitely of working class women, and definitely of communist Black working class women, because of the sort of organizing work they're doing. I mean, women's studies ends up acting as if everyone's a liberal, right? As if everyone just wanted inclusion within a dominant system of repression so that they could have a good chance of fighting their way to the top. And these women weren't arguing for this, right? They were defending and advancing different kinds of rights within a larger struggle for socialism. So I wanted to hold up that contribution that they're making, because it really makes women's history and women's studies look like a very different field if these voices are brought in.
You know, so we also thought this made a great contribution to labor history, because too often who counts as a laborer is like a white male factory worker. First of all, we ain't got no more factories. And secondly, even when factories were sort of the predominant mode of, the predominant mode in the political economy, there was still a very important sector that was often left out of who counts as revolutionary subjects, what type of labor is performed, what are laboring conditions, because we weren't paying attention to Black women who predominantly were reduced to domestic labor. And paying attention to domestic labor, I believe, does give us some hints as to how to organize now contingent, precarious, and informal labor, because the types of things that they were fighting for was to be protected by social legislation that didn't pertain to them, to have regularized hours, to have regular wages, when oftentimes, housewives would be trying to pay them in food scraps and clothes and kind and not in wages. How do you organize yourself in informal ways when you're locked out of unions, right? And so when we introduce Black communist women into labor history, we show that they are union organizers, that they are trying to organize in factories and in industrial work, but their primary concern for a very, very long time is how do we organize domestic workers, and how do we combat this idea that they're unorganizable, this racist, sexist, and peniophobic, so anti-poor idea that Black women are not organizable. And I think the another aspect of this is the women that committed class suicide. So as Michael mentioned, Louise Thompson Patterson, for example, was trained here at Berkeley. So she could have gone on and to live a very petty bourgeois life, but chose not to. She chose to understand herself as a worker and to align with the working class. Same with Esther Cooper Jackson. So we have a portion of her master's thesis within this work. She also, committed class suicide and went on to be an organizer in the Southern Negro Youth Congress, as well as other organizations. And so again, this idea of labor is not only about the types of work and workplaces, but also who is going to bring about the structural transformation that we seek. And so I think there's a lot of information in this book about that.
And I'll also talk a little bit about how it connects with my field, which is political theory, and especially Marxist political theory, is that, guess what? Once you recognize that these are Black radical women who are writing Marxist theory, it doesn't look like a white Eurocentric field. It looks really different. I mean, they bring in, so Claudia Jones will refer to trajectories that include Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, right? That's one great big line, right? And it's a line of resistance, a line of revolution. It's not like, she doesn't separate them. She thinks of these things together. And I think the general emphasis on finding the patterns across history, finding the connections among oppression, not at the level of identity, but at the level of structures, in order to see how revolutions unfold and in order to see the struggles of the oppressed from the bottom, is an enormous contribution. This is not a communism that looks like it's dictated by Moscow. This looks like a communism that's rising up from organizing tenants unions in Harlem. It's a communism that's rising up from the organizing needle workers, from working in the American South, from seeing what's happening in the American South as like what's happening in Italy with the rise of fascism, as like what happens in Germany with the rise of fascism. So you get a really different vision of 20th century politics and of Marxism, when it's not just kind of some overly abstracted, oh, Marxism just means you read Marx. I mean, sure, you can read Marx, that's interesting, but you can also see the practical work of tenant organizing connected with people. One of the pieces that I've been thinking a lot about lately is from Louise Thompson Patterson, and she's talking about the very practical step-by-step organizing around the Scottsboro Boys campaign. And one of the things she mentions, it's almost like an aside, is she's staying with some of the different families of the young men who'd been imprisoned. And many of these families are very, very poor. And she talks, and she's got a line that's something to the effect, but like, I slept in their houses, I ate their food, they stayed in my houses, they ate my food, I drove them around, and I think they developed a bit of confidence in me. It was that close connection actually with real struggles that was informing her work and her commitments and her theorization. And sometimes people say, oh, well, the researchers need to talk to people. Like, well, isn't that already obvious? Isn't it much more working closely with and not having a kind of separateness from them? So I think a practical engagement in people's lives through struggle as it is impacting their analysis, their agitational writing, their committed, propagandistic writing is actually a really important aspect that helps change how we understand what Marxism is.
So then we wanted to sort of go into, we can kind of like popcorn, some of the readings that are from the text that are not only interesting, but that are particularly germane to this time. So the first one I want to lift up is at the end of the book. It's on page 278, and it's it's called Prison, the Bell Fund Affair. And this is actually an excerpt by Dorothy Hunton from a book called Alpheus Hunton, The Unsung Valiant. So it's the only biography of the mighty Alpheus Hunton. It's a very important book. And I will say, due to like X is trash now. Well, I guess maybe it's always been, I don't know. But I posted on Twitter that we needed to republish this book, Alpheus Hunt and the Unsung Valiant, because I had very old copies and the binding kept breaking. And so international publishers connected with me. And so we came out with an updated version and I wrote the new foreword for it. So pick it up. Okay. So what is important, I want to read a particular section from this book. I write about the intersections of anti-communism and anti-Blackness, and Dorothy Hunton speaks to it here. She says that along with the intensified practice of establishing guilt by unsupported accusations and character assassination by alleged association, there grew steadily a pattern of linking the advocacy of full equality for Blacks and minorities with un-Americanism. Frequently in examinations designed to test the loyalty of applicants for government positions, the question was asked whether they believed in equality of the white and Black races or entertained Blacks in their homes. It was not unusual in many areas for those defending non-segregated housing to be branded as communists. Long ago, those who pleaded for low-cost housing had been called socialists. I think that that's really important, especially as we see, and you know, emblancamiento, a whitening of the federal government right now, the way that we can see and different types of loyalty tests, right? They're harebrained loyalty to Trump. But anyway, we can see a resurgence of this kind of questioning that tries to link up any sort of commitment to racial equality or racial justice with subversion or so-called Marxism, cultural Marxism, and all these other terms that they're throwing around without knowing what they're talking about. And so I think that this piece is really important because she talks a lot about McCarthyism, and we can see how our current moment, just much as McCarthyism is one iteration of a broad Red Scare that constitutes this country, we can think of this moment as another Red Scare that's intensifying.
I want to mention a couple of the pieces that I found particularly helpful for thinking about domestic work and service work, as Charisse mentioned. One of these was the master's thesis of Esther Cooper Jackson. And we have a pretty large excerpt from it, actually. And it's called The Negro Woman Domestic Worker. And some of the things that are interesting about this is, one, I think it was the very first one that ever was an empirical study. And she notices, for example, that most white women domestic workers are single, and most Black women domestic workers at the time are married. Like, they had family responsibilities. It wasn't that they would go home and, like, you know, I don't know, like take care of a cat or go to bed. They actually had to go home and really take care of their families, in part because of the exclusion of Black men from decent jobs. And so they had major responsibilities that put them in a very different, in a different place in the workforce. She also notices that Black women in domestic work, that there's regional differences, that the challenges of organizing were different in the North and in the South, and that they had different abilities to, like, for what they were willing to advocate and what they were willing to fight for based on their family responsibilities. One of the things that makes this interesting, other than just empirically, sociologically interesting, is it contrasts with some fairly well-known Marxist feminist discussions of wages for housework, as if the domestic sphere were not a place of actual exploited wage labor and wage theft. This is a theme that's in quite a few of the pieces here. And I just keep wondering if the white feminist in the 70s had paid attention to this writing, might there have been a very different understanding of the so-called wages for housework campaign? Because people have been paid and underpaid wages for housework throughout US history. One of the other pieces on in this vein, but a lot of them talk about this, is the Bronx slave market. That's a pretty famous piece. I don't know if y'all have heard of it. It's by Ella Baker and Marvel Cook. And they do real, like, sort of, participant research, right? They go out on the street corners and talk to the women who are trying to basically get day labor jobs. This is like during the Depression. And what's happening is, because of Depression, they've been kicked out of better positions in hotels and restaurants and rich households. And now more middle class and lower middle class and working class families are getting their labor from them, are buying them, and they are just bargaining them down more and more and more. And they are like charging them for lunch and charging them for transportation and saying, oh, you didn't do this good a job. And there's sexual harassment always happening. And like, there's no sisterhood here. These are white women coming into these, onto these street corners to get day labor for, to help with their housework. And they are trying to get it for as low as they possibly can. And one of the things that Baker and Cook discover is that actually the women are forming kind of nascent unions. Like they're making agreements among themselves. Okay, like nobody accept less than 35 cents a day. Like we've got to stand strong. And if somebody doesn't, then they get mad at them.
They beat them up. Like, let's be honest. They physically assault them.
And so what they see is like, this is the market. This is the market right here, and people are learning about it, and what they're learning is stronger together. And so I just keep thinking, like, if people had approached housework in this stronger together, fighting for something rather than this, I don't know, rather than the kind of white 70s version of wages for housework, it would have been different. But they see it as the labor market right here, and they're building proto-unions.
Mm-hmm. So, the next piece I want to talk about is the proclamation of the Sojourners for Truth and Justice. So this is an organization that I love. The Sojourners for Truth and Justice were an all Black organization founded in 1951, and it included women who were in or adjacent to the Communist Party, but they insisted that this is a separate organization. This is not a communist front. It is Black women who are getting together to organize for a number of things. So they mention it in their proclamation: the passage of an anti-lynching law, the passage of an anti-poll tax, the passage of a fair employment practice law, the immediate freedom of Rosalie Ingram, who was a sharecropper who along with her son was thrown in prison for ultimately murdering a white landowner for assaulting her. The dropping of all persecution and prosecution of our great leaders, and the coming together of our government with other great nations to work out the guarantees for a permanent world peace. And so I lift up this organization because it's a Black women's organization, but it is not identitarian. They are not engaging in identity reductionism. They understand that as Black women, they have both a stake in all of these structural malformations, and they have a responsibility to organize against them. And so they do recognize themselves as Black women, but they see themselves as inextricably linked with Black men and with other oppressed people. So for example, what they say is that they have a piece about how they don't want, or they are they're indignant at the policy of government which forces our sons, husbands, sweethearts, and brothers into a Jim Crow army to fight in the name of democracy in foreign lands, where they must face frame-up court-martials while at home neither they nor their people are free. So not only are they taking an anti-war stance, but unlike some later feminist politics, they don't see men and women as in antagonistic positions, but they also don't see themselves as ancillary to men. They see themselves as historical revolutionary subjects, and they understand that in this all Black women's organization, they get to set and dictate the terms of their struggle, even as their struggles apply to many different groups, right? Because they're offering up structural critiques. And I think that that's really important to understand now, where we can see more and more permutations of identity whereby we don't see connections between our struggles. We see, and there's more and more turning inward in an individual way and also in a group way, again, whereby we're undermining the necessity of solidarity, of looking out for one another, of linking up our struggles. And I really think the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, this tiny Black women's organization, really modeled what it means to struggle for one's group, but to struggle for one's group in the service of broader, of a broader sort of revolutionary praxis.
I recently had a discussion with a student who was, he's grappling with, does he think of himself as a communist and what does this mean? And he's been more attracted to anarchism. And so he's like, well, what are you all doing? And aren't you just like waiting for the revolution? And I think y'all have heard this kind of line before, that's all, communists are doing. And I just want to make a list and read you off this list of the kinds of activities these women are engaged in. Tenants unions, labor unions, legal defense campaigns, organizing conferences, congresses, forming clubs, organizing marches, rallies, mass meetings, fundraising, agitation and propaganda, knowledge production, speaking tours, a sewing project, schools and training, social events, relief aid support, I already said court support, and building the international peace movement. And what's exciting is that all of these, we might say, well, all of these things happen now. Yeah, but they're not under an umbrella that lets them resonate with one another and build and reinforce one another so that the struggles are legible as part of one fight against a capitalist imperialist system. And so one of the things that makes their work exciting is like it can endure and cross internationally and historically over, over space and over time. They're never just single fights. Any single fight, like the Rosalie Ingram case, that becomes exemplary of the larger fight against the racist system and segregation system in the United States. It becomes exemplary of the failure of the US government to guarantee any rights for Black people. So every single individual struggle becomes an example of the larger one. I want to kind of close my part of this section of our presentation by reading the piece that it's I guess my favorite one, particularly rhetorically in the book. It's by Islanda Good-Robeson, and it was published in Paul Robeson and Louis Burnham's magazine called Freedom, and this is in June 1953. And it's called Unrest in Africa Due to Oppression. And she writes, "The struggle of the African people in Kenya for the return of their land, the struggle of the African, Indian, and colored people in South Africa against segregation and discrimination, the struggle of the North African people in Tunisia and Morocco for control of their land, resources, and internal affairs, the struggle of the people of Indochina and Malaya for control of their natural wealth. All of these are closely related to the struggle of the Negro people here in these United States for truly representative government and full equality. And these struggles are essentially another part of the successful struggle of the peoples of India and of Indonesia for self-government and independence. Their victories are our victories. And to go a little further back in history, the successful struggle of the Chinese people under the warlords and of the Russian people under the czars for control of their land, resources, and government were and are part of the whole picture, and their victories are also our victories. Their victories are also our victories. I mean, that's an incredible, incredible message that, to my mind, has gotten lost in some ways in the 20th century. I also think that's been part of the repression of support for Palestine, because nobody wants us to see their victories are our victories or their fight back as our fight back. But this was their primary message, is seeing the victories and the struggles for the oppressed as part of one struggle.
So the piece I want to end on is by Williana Burroughs, who was one of the earliest Black women members of the Communist Party, and it's called "Negro Work Has Not Been Entirely Successful." And I want to lift this piece up because as we write about in the introduction, there's a lot of people treat Black radicals or Black communists as if they're successful despite communism, right? Or they try to absolve or remove particular people from their communist affiliation or communist roots, which is why, for example, you might never know that Du Bois was a member of the Communist Party. And so she starts off this piece by saying that every single campaign in which the Communist Party engages is relevant to Black people. Women's work, miners' relief, foreign-born work, unemployment, organizing the unorganized, anti-imperialism, youth work, the International Labor Defense, which defended both Black people and political minorities. And then workers' relief. So all of these things that have separate committees are relevant to Black people, which is why the Communist Party needs to do a better job of organizing them. But I also want to lift this up because she wages that struggle within the party, too often now when we're in organizations, we want to throw these truth bombs and blow this shit up, excuse me, my language, and then move on, right? We don't wage principled struggle within our organizations or within our collectives, right? If things don't go our way, or we see contradictions and antagonisms that are inevitable in any organization, we leave, and even worse than that, we leave, try to collapse the thing, instead of waging that struggle and holding the organization or the party or the collective to its ideals. Like, we don't know how to engage in that type of work. And Williana Burroughs is doing this in 1928. And she doesn't just come with criticism or self-criticism. She also comes with solutions. And this is another thing that we lack. We can point out every single thing that's wrong. And newsflash, any organization that doesn't have some type of contradiction or antagonism is a CIA front. Like, it's not a real thing. We live in a patriarchal, capitalist, imperialist, colonial, et cetera, society. So those contradictions are gonna show up in all of our organizations. The work is to engage in principled struggle to eradicate these contradictions to the best of our ability. And so I think when you buy this book, that is a really important piece to lift up, because also much of the solutions that she lifts up are still relevant today, right? Sometimes in our organizations, we're still scared to organize ordinary Black people, right? Not people like in this room, right? We're the petty bouge, but ordinary Black people. And she understood how important that was. And it's still important. She understood how important organizing the South was. And that's still important. Too often we talk about lopping Texas and Florida off into the ocean as if they don't have majority to plurality Black people there who are struggling and who've been struggling against these fascist-like elements that are arising. And so, we can learn a lot from Williana Burroughs in 1928.
So we're gonna switch into talking a little bit about our own research projects, the things that.
How are we doing for time? Okay.
But as we're doing the segue, I'll just say a little bit about why the book is useful pedagogically. We have things that are speeches, reports, newspaper articles, a few, like some really short pieces. We have long pieces that were published in the Communist Party's primary publications. We have things like really short ones, like a Williana Burroughs piece about like why they need to worry about food, the crappy food that's being sold in the area. So there's a lot of stuff that's really useful pedagogically. We have two pieces that are by Alice Childress that are from her column on Mildred, which was the perspective of a domestic worker who's talking to a friend. And these are really good as an everyday kind of discussion. Like it says, look at these hands do the work. And talking to like two domestic workers talking about why is McCarthy so worried about communists? What are communists anyway? So I think there's a lot that folks can do in different kinds of classrooms with the texts that are collected here.
Sorry, my daughter I knew she was gonna do that. Just throwing the bottle top because people keep picking it up. Just put it in your pocket, please. Sorry, that's Sankara, everybody. She's here for our entertainment. So this event is called, Organized Fight When Combating Repression, Building Power. And so I'm gonna speak to the combating repression component. And I'll speak to it relatively quickly because I do want us to have time for dialogue and for grounding. So the first thing I want to talk about, so I wrote this book, Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States. And the upshot of that book is that anti-radicalism and anti-Black racial oppression are co-constitutive, that you really can't understand one without understanding the other. And the examples abound of this. But one that I want to lift up now is that we see that the right wing and even some liberals, to be quite frank, used this moment of Palestinian liberation organizing to attack DEI, right? And DEI means Black people, let's be clear, and oppressed genders, right? But often Black people, that's what they're saying. And this is nothing new. Oftentimes, struggles for redistribution, for structural transformation, for even things as simple as better working conditions are often Black baited, right? You know, the fact that this might benefit my baby, the fact that this might benefit Black people is lifted up as a reason to not do it. Or conversely, if Black people are struggling for any type of rights, recognition, equality, they're then red baited, right? That this is communism, this is outside agitators, this is China or Russia in these times, right? So if we look at what was happening, for example, during the George Floyd protest, there was so much discourse about Chinese funding. When there was an uptick in anti-war activism here a few years ago against both Israeli aggression and various things that the United States is doing around the world, there was a New York Times hit piece against organizations like the People's Forum being backed by China. And so there's always this anti-radical discourse that accompanies movements, uprisings and rebellions that are led by Black people or relevant to them. And so we need to understand this, right? And so when our so-called friends on the left, as Gerald Horne puts it, want to attribute any acknowledgement of settler colonialism or of race to identity politics, these are the things that we need to point out, right? The racial logics of these forms of repression. The other thing that we need to think about is repression at the state level, institutional, and interpersonal level. And so again, we can see this with the attempt to crush the encampments this past summer, right? So there was a state response. So there's these committees that are convened in the House of Representatives. And then our, lily-livered institutions folded like lawn chairs, some of them preemptively so, to try to avoid, to the best of their ability, this repression, which they cannot do. And then they took it upon themselves this summer to meet with police forces, to further militarize our campuses, right? And then you have the interpersonal level. And so this has to do with how people treat you, people snitching on you, people infiltrating your organizations in order to bring it down. And so these forms of repression are happening at all of these three levels at once, and we need to be mindful of how this is happening, but we cannot be scared. We cannot be cowed by this. We have to keep on going. We have to have more fortitude and more courage, right, than those who are invested in our demise. I'm writing a book now about mutual comradeship as a means of combating repression. And mutual comradeship has an ethical, epistemological, and political component. And so I'll just suffice it to say that to combat repression, we really need to think about ethics. How do we treat each other? How do we treat ourselves? How do we treat the organizations that we're in? Who do we value and devalue? These are things that we don't often think about concretely, or we don't often address directly in our organizations or even in our institutions. And we can be quite fascistic in how we treat each other, right? Quite carceral in how we treat each other. And that is something that we need to, you need to kill the fascist in yourself. Epistemology, how are we understanding the world? Right? How are we justifying the beliefs that we have? How are we, explaining this moment, right? These all have epistemological implications. Do we understand what's happening as inevitable? Or do we realize that this is somebody's vision? Somebody worked very hard to implement the world that we are inhabiting now, which is to say that there's another vision that's possible if we work for it. And then politics. So how are we struggling for power? Plain and simple. Are we struggling for power? And then the last thing I'll say, I think that to combat repression, we need to believe our own analysis. And it's interesting. I was having a conversation with the great Dr. Eula Taylor yesterday about something along these lines, how the attack on DEI currently, for those of us on the left, we've already had a critique of DEI, how, putting a few chips in the cookie who often have the hegemonic understanding, that's not doing anything for us. If we look, for example, at Roxanne Gay at Harvard, I'd be on her helmet, I'm sorry, but like, she was no friend of students, of Palestinian students, and yet we found ourselves sort of defending her because we know the way that Black women are often attacked or become the face of the ills of any institution. But she's an enemy. And we need to remember that. We need to believe our own analysis even when it's hard. And so right now, the time is not to defend DEI. The time is to defend our vision and what it is that DEI has been used to mitigate, to co-opt, and to crush. And so when we know that when we talk about these institutions as the intellectual arm of the state, we talk about these institutions as militarized and oppressive and repressive, we cannot be heartbroken when they convey exactly who they are. We have to remember, we know this. And so what are we going to do about it? And so too often, because we let the right set our agenda, we forget that our analysis tells us something else. And this is what we need to focus on. We cannot let, we have to be clear about whether we're against oppression or whether we are against a particular rate of oppression. Right? And now is the time. This is Super Bowl for those of us who believe in justice. This is what we train for, right? Go Birds.
I don't have an elegant segue, so I'll just, I want to tell you a little bit about my forthcoming book, Capital's Grave, Neo-Feudalism and the New Class Struggle, and it'll be out in about a month. And it, of course, it connects with what we're talking about because it's linked to how to understand the present and how to organize for power. What I argue in the book is that capitalism is turning into something that is no longer capitalist, but more like feudalism. It relies more on rents, destruction, and predation, on what Robert Brenner calls the politically driven upward redistribution of wealth, or we could say taking, not making. So the basic idea is that capitalism is turning itself into something that's no longer recognizably capitalist, but more like feudalism. I'm going to give you a little background of how I came up with this and its relation to some current debates and some of the features of the idea, and then what it means for struggle. So the background of it is, before I do that, just like to hammer home the idea, the basic idea is like 40 years of neoliberalism has had an impact. It's not like, and it's not just like we can have perpetual neoliberalism forever. It's become something else, right? The old is dying and the new is becoming something really bad. Something like what's becoming, what we're getting is something really quite monstrous, right? That's what's being born. A new kind of feudalism where the majority of workers feel that they're trapped in something, and in fact are, some kind of servitude, some kind of service, or we even say some kind of serfdom. And I play fast and loose with these categories, in part to make the point, to make it visible for us. All right, so the background. Hey, hi, how are you? Okay. A few years ago, Mackenzie Wark had a book, Capital is Dead. And when she was first kind of shopping around the thesis that capital is dead, we're not in capitalism anymore, I thought this was nuts. I'm like, oh, come on. And then it's one of those ideas that kept, like, it was like a brain worm. It like kept eating away. And finally, I'm like, well, what if she's right? What happens if she's right? And I found it really liberating to start to think that way. And it made me start seeing, yeah, there are the same sorts of tendencies and phenomenon can operate according to different kinds of logic. And in the book and in the background work, and that's also in one of the chapters, I look at Marx in the Grundrisse and how he talks about how the same set of elements are present before capitalism and after capitalism, but they take a different relation to one another. And I think once we start looking at our present, we can start to see this. And so the basic idea is capitalism is following different laws of motion now, right? It's not trying to invest, they eat their proceeds, right? They're not trying to create, they're taking the money from us with the rents, right? They're relying on destruction of sectors rather than creation. So this is the general idea. Now, you may have come across already the idea of techno-feudalism. I think in California, Silicon Valley, y'all know this, you're already there. But the last year or two, Yanis Varoufakis has a book on techno-feudalism. Another thinker, French guy, Cedric Durand, has an upcoming book on techno-feudalism. And I'm in dialogue with these folks. There's a lot of similarity, and I don't want to get into a nitpicky fight, but I think that they ignore the majority of people in the world who are in services, right? So we are in a new kind of feudalism, but let's pay attention to what this means for most workers. The majority of people in the world are in some version of services, whether or not it's paid or unpaid, formal or informal. Whether or not it's legal or illegal, the majority, there's only one, you can look at all sorts of World Bank statistics. Only one region in the world has a majority in industry, and that's the Middle East, because they still have folks, a lot of population in the oil sector. But every other place, even places that we associate now with having a large factory labor force, the majority of people are in some kind of services. All right, now, so on one hand, that means our class analysis is different. I think it can tell us a few things, though. It can tell us why it's been so hard over the last 30 years to get people to think about themselves as part of a working class. It's like, we don't feel like we're producing a future. We're just serving the consumption needs of people with more money than us. Right, that's it. Like many of us in here, we serve the consumption needs of the children of the wealthy or the children of a struggling class, hoping to make it. But it's very hard to see a future. It's that, and so my idea is actually, but what if there is a future here around services? And so this is the kind of wager of the book that I hope to persuade people of, and that I hope actually can provide a sense of organizing with possibility, and that is. So we're on a warming planet, right? Our future is not going to be one based in industry. It doesn't mean we have to all be peasants, right? Agricultural workers, that's also not realistic because we're on a warming planet, right? But what we can think about is all of the services. Services are sort of, in the technical Marxist vocabulary, unproductive labor, but necessary labor. They're unproductive because they're not producing commodities, but they're necessary because we need them to survive. So what if we recognize that on a warming planet, what we need is to actually recognize our work as serving one another and serving the collective, not like producing stuff. Like, of course, some stuff has to be produced, I'm not saying that, but if the majority of the workers are in services, that can be what we need on a warming planet. So the communist idea would be, yes, of course, a society of working people, right? No longer, no private property, all the typical communist stuff. But instead of having to think of the industrial working classes ushering in the future, we recognize services as ushering the future, the only future that's actually going to be possible on a warming planet. And the reality is that actually that's where we're seeing really effective organizing happening. Teachers, nurses, baristas, right? These are like Amazon workers, right? They're not factory workers, right? They're warehouse workers. All of these are part of this large group of services. So so my thought is that in the same way that the sort of Marxism of the Second International thought that what you do is combine the idea of socialism with the industrial working class, we now have to think about the idea of communism on a warming planet with the idea of services, from all of the unpaid domestic care work through the whole variety of services that we all need to survive. So that's the general idea, and I know we want to have time for conversations. I can talk about more later.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll have a round of applause here. Yeah. First of all, shout out to the working mom, two of them, and the fantastic tag team presentation. That was beautiful. My prerogative here, I'll ask a question and then we'll turn to the group. And I would like to hear from you what you think the resources are from in Organized Fight Win in terms of how this community, this collection of writers is thinking about theorizing and responding to the threat of fascism and how you can read sort of anti-fascism in these works. And then I'll gladly turn this to the crowd for questions.
Yeah, so we have a whole section that is section 3, Fighting Fascism. So essentially, I think that what many of these writers point out is that the nexus of racial oppression, anti-Black racial oppression in particular, war, imperialism, economic downturn, and attack on women. This is the sort of recipe for a particular type of fascism. And in fact, this is the way that Black people have experienced a condition of fascism within the context of the United States. And so whether they're talking about victory at home or victory abroad, or whether they're talking about the fascistic character of the United States, effectively what they're saying is that, first of all, this myth, U.S. democracy is effectively a myth if you look at the way that Black people are treated. Secondly, that if the sort of empowerment of monopoly continues the way it is, that the United States will be the sort of leading fascist power sooner rather than later. And thirdly, in order to have an anti-fascist front, we need to have an internationalist analysis. We need to center the working class. We need to be anti-war and anti-imperialist. That if all of those things come together, you don't have a true anti-fascist politic.
Absolutely, and to add on to what Charisse is describing, I'm just so enchanted with Sankara. I just can barely think. One of the great things to me in the book is a particular text from Claudia Jones from her International Women's Day speech. It's the speech that ended up getting her deported, and she's emphasizing the way that the magazines of the U.S. ruling class are pushing a Hitlerite ideology of Kinder, Kirche, Küche, like children, hearth, kitchen, and church. And they're trying to push women back in the home. And she's like, this was straight up Hitlerite ideology, and now it's in the United States. And it's a deliberate, and so her gender analysis is great. And of course, she makes it more complex than that. She's like, and this has a really particular effect on Black families because they're first hired, first fired. And it's not like they have a white male winner in a decent paying job. They're going to get kicked out, and their position gets worse, even though it had been getting a little bit better when they had factory jobs during the war. And so we get the race dimension of that domestic ideology and the way that domestic ideology is being used for fascism. And I think in the present, we really are seeing this intense emphasis on there can only be two sexes, right? Like how come? Like why? Yeah, why do you care? Like, well, why do you care? It's like, presumably because they're trying to reinforce a particular version of the family, because only that version of the family is going to be, able to produce the workers that they need to keep in what do they call it? Industrial policy, which isn't really industrial policy anymore. It's just a, sort of fortress mentality.
The other thing I want to point out, and I think in that same piece, when we're taking our history classes, we learn about the Marshall Plan and how the Marshall Plan was this great thing because it rebuilt Europe and it helped to, build this global community. And Claudia Jones talks about, no, this is actually, it has funded the fascists. That the Marshall Plan is a means of disciplining Europe and imposing a U.S. market economy. And it actually did. Much of that money went to literally rearming West Germany in particular, which is the fascists. And so part of having an anti-fascist consciousness is knowing this history and knowing a real history that the U.S. did, to the extent that the U.S. did fight against the fascists, that did just as much to sort of normalize fascism and abet fascism as they did to fight it. And that's what we need to understand.
Fabulous. Questions?
Professors, thank you so much for this informative history and dialogue. So my question was about some of the themes that you covered. So if maybe you could say something about the relationship between Black Marxism and like the growing trend of Afro-pessimism in the field of Black studies, and maybe like how that may have impacted both like internationalism and like solidarity relationships between different groups like in this current moment.
Well, we'll do a little soft punt on this. So what would that be, like an onside kick? I've been watching a lot of football. What I'll say is that so none of these women, I think, would subscribe to an Afro-pessimist position, nor would their work, I think, be like amenable to what the sort of aims and objectives of that particular project are. I think, number one thing that you noted is like solidarity. They do believe that even across difference and even across these contradictions amongst races and ethnic groups, there is a basis of solidarity, especially if we take seriously the way that these structures of domination like imperialism, colonialism, war, and capitalism affect the overwhelming majority of the world, except for this tiny ruling class. I think that secondly, through struggle, they were optimistic that there is a possibility of structural transformation. And I don't know that is the sort of Afro-pessimist project. They're making a very materialist argument and not an ontological one. And so I think that, and also, their theories don't derive from academia. So their theories derive from struggle and from sort of being in like real world organizations. Not that things that emanate from academia are inherently not useful, but I just think it's a different sort of political project, a different focus. And so.
I'll just add in everything she said. I mean, they believe that race and racism have a history. Right? That it's not one given everywhere all the time constitutive of civilization itself, which actually strikes me as much more sensible to think about things having a history. And also, because they're oriented around struggle, they recognize that they emphasize the importance of Black and white working class alliances. The white working class needs to defend Black people, because if they don't, then Black people will be strike breakers. Right? It's a very practical analysis. The Black workers need white people because Black workers are minority. So so there's a mutual self-interest and that's what labor organizing has to do, is bring people together, try to break these barriers that the bosses want to encourage for their own self-interest. And so I think that that's one of the things that they kind of, the Afro-pessimist part, I mean, it's explicitly not a politics, right? And this is explicitly a politics. I actually think pedagogically that these essays are great counters to read together for people to think, okay, which one lets you do, what are the different texts and approaches let you do?
Well, that was extremely helpful. Thank you. A good question. That was great. What other questions do we have?
Thank you all so much for this. Great to see folks. I have a question about, so it was mentioned that Black communist women were very crucial for building the international peace movement. And I'm wondering if you could both expand upon that.
Yeah, so I think that, Black women were part of these like international peace congresses, for example. So Lorraine Hansberry attended one. We have her speech. She attended in the stead, or her report back. She attended in the stead of Paul Robeson because his passport was suspended. And so Claudia Jones is at the forefront of of peace activism because they understood, because war is essential. War is foundational to US imperialism, and war is foundational to creating a set of social relations whereby fear and repression are not only pervade, but are normalized. They also understand the ways that war sort of distort the labor market and give a false sense of progress on the one hand, but then after the sort of wartime boom rolls back, it also creates the conditions for massive economic repression precisely against racialized people and women. And so I think that the international peace movement, or Black women are central to the international peace movement because of its effects on political economy, because of its effects on their loved ones, right? Like as I read in the Sojourner for Truth and Justice piece, it's like these are their husbands, their fathers, their sons, and their brothers going to fight other racialized people while they enjoy no rights at home. But it's also important to emphasize that they're not pacifists. Right. Like radical peace activists, peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the achievement of a world beyond colonialism, imperialism, and racial domination. And so I think that they understand that as well, which is why they are proponents of self-defense and self-determination. Like these are not antithetical to peace. These are constitutive components of a durable, achievable, like global peace.
I'll just add in, there's a really interesting practical aspect of this that I actually started noticing more over the last couple of days, because when we first brought the book out, we did a bunch of events about it, and then you get a little bit of distance. And I've been thinking about how it was just a couple of sentences in some of the peace movement pieces where bringing people into the movement brings them into struggle in a really practical, material way, right? It's building bravery, it's building skills, it's bringing connections, it's creating an attitude of struggle. And so, and sometimes it can be like any of the struggles, but the struggle against the A-bomb and against the H-bomb, they were globally important, and people get involved, then they start to remain involved and connect with others and then start to build and see their capacity. So that seems like that's what working class and people's movements have to be. And the anti-war and peace movement was doing that.
Wonderful. Here, thank you.
Hey, I noticed that I was looking at the screen behind you, and I noticed that a lot of the women were born in 1915 or thereabouts. And I was wondering if that suggests that there was some kind of moment, like say in the early 50s or late 40s, that was really open to Black women joining the Communist Party, and whether conditions have changed, or that's just a fluke, or...
I never noticed that, but it's that's around the 40s would be right. The late 30s, early 40s is when they would be coming of age, and I think that is also the moment of the sort of golden age of the CPUSA, as it were. Right, this is when they're at the forefront of struggling for the Scottsboro Boys and Angelo Herndon, and against the invasion of Abyssinia. They're participating in the struggle in the Spanish Civil War. They're doing the tenant organizing. They're foundational to organizing the Congress of Industrial Organizations and of challenging segregated shops. So they're seeding all of so really it is the Communist Party, like the methodology of the civil rights movement actually comes from the Communist Party. So the sort of doing alongside legal work, staging popular protest, and getting ordinary people invested and involved in these defense, the defense campaigns, that's actually something that is really innovated by the Communist Party in a fundamental way, and then is sort of maybe taken to a different level by the civil rights movement. And so I think that it probably has to do with when people are, coming to a particular type of consciousness, when you're in your 20s-ish, like that's when you're, young and vibrant and you still have some optimism, plus the correlation of forces, right? On the one hand, there's fascism. There's a rise of fascism. On the other hand, you have this strong working class fighting force that at least nominally and oftentimes, and to the best of their ability in practice, is modeling like an affirmative action. They're modeling a form of interracial struggle that actually attempts to treat Black people on an equal plane in ways that this is just simply not the case in other organizations, not even like the NAACP at this time.
I think that's a really interesting observation. One thing I've observed is actually a lot of them live a really long life. And so I always like to say, you want to live a long life, be a communist. Like they lived to over 100.
Yeah, but the other side to that is like the women lived a long time, but not Claudia Jones. So they either died early of often heart-related problems. So you got Ben Davis, Pettis Perry, Claudia Jones, probably the Repression, right? Or they lived to be like 100 plus.
Make it to 60.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just to add, I think it's a fascinating observation. I mean, I think I always think of this when I read this book. I'm thinking, the sort of Raymond Williams, Michael Denning project of sort of a generational analysis. And here's a sort of generation, and they sort of arise out of this moment, and they join the party in a historically situated moment, and that makes a tremendous amount of sense. Thank you. Any other? What other questions? Please, Eula.
First of all, you guys rock. I'm sure this is in the introduction, and I'm going to buy the book outside of it, but I'm curious about which women have fallen outside of the book. That is, usually, you're limited by page numbers, you can only do so much. And so I'm just curious, if you had like a volume 2, who would be the people that you would include?
Well, I personally wouldn't do a volume 2. That we have laid down the gauntlet for other people to pick it up. But I think that one glaring, precisely.
Yeah, your students can do it.
So one, it's time bounded, right? This is like 1919 to 1957. So we stop at that moment. But I think that a glaring omission is Queen Mother Moore. And that is for a number. One is that she doesn't have that many writings that we discovered. Now, maybe when Ashley Farmer's biography comes out, we can look at the footnotes and see her writings. Secondly, she had left the Communist Party by the end of the 1930s because she felt they moved away from their commitment to Black self-determination and the Black Belt thesis. But she was in the Communist Party. She was an important organizer therein. And so she is missing, I think, who else? That's the
Shirley Graham Du Bois.
Yeah, Shirley Graham. I have such a complicated relationship with her, but not really. I don't know her, but ancestrally. But yeah, so she's definitely missing, Shirley Graham Du Bois. And I don't remember why. It's just a matter of maybe her work was more accessible, because we also were trying to gather up things that weren't as readily available. Yeah.
We spent a lot of time, figuring out how we were going to do this, because not everyone that we put under the umbrella of communist was in the party. And so it was in the milieu, so adjacent. And then it starts to be, well, how adjacent is adjacent? And then it's just like, well, who counts as a communist? Are we going to let, Trots in? Or what is going to happen there? And so by using the sort of 56, 57 as the cutoff, we were able to solve some of those kind of inclusion problems. I think another volume would need to be outside of a US-centric approach. And then you've got a lot of interesting challenges around translation, and so much important work isn't archived, isn't collected. And then you have the complicated questions like, well, in the broader anti-colonial struggle, who are you going to count as Black exactly? Right? Are you going to count are you only going to count sort of the African diaspora when a lot of the movements were much more overlapping, intersecting, mutually helping one another? Like, do you count the Latin American ones? So there are a lot of kind of questions that would be like, you could have like a kind of global, a much more global one, anti-imperialist feminist writing. But it's interesting to keep the exercise going of what's your principle of inclusion and exclusion. Our other thing is like, there were really interesting pieces in the Communist Party publications about organizing Black women, but they would either have no author, or it might have been a male author. And we really wanted to hold up the particular voices of these organizers, rather than people writing about organizing from an outside point. We wanted the inside point. So, Yeah, I hope that it would stimulate more. I know one thing when we gave this in New York, someone's like, oh, well, would it be okay if we did a brown communist women book? I'm like, of course, that would really be, fantastic. So I think it's like, we think about this as like a seed and a contribution, a support book, particularly for the, important histories that are out there, like Eric McDuffie's and Deo Gore's, and that it should be a start off point, not like the thing.
Yeah, but really thinking about, so this is definitely Communist Party, like CPUSA. But Grace Campbell, for example, went on to be like in the Lovestonite faction, if you know anything about communist history. So like communism isn't reducible to the Communist Party. So or even socialist women would be, I think, an important intervention, because those women I can't even name any. Polly Murray. So like that would be, I think, an important addition. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question. Any takers?
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you, that was great. So my question ultimately has to do with like the retreat away from communism by like grassroots, Black people, in politics. Do you think there was when would you identify a moment maybe when everyday people kind of started to retreat from communism, if you agree that that happened? And what do you think the consequences of this retreat might have been on Black politics more broadly?
I think there are two broad moments. One is 1939. That was the sort of first wave, and that's the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That was one wave of Black people leaving the Communist Party because they just could not support that particular alliance between Germany and the USSR. And part of that also, again, part of that milieu is the rise of so-called Browderism. And so when Earl Browder became the leader of the Communist Party, he not only dissolved the Communist Party, but prior to that, there was a sort of turn to the anti-fascism over a commitment to anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, or some people interpreted it as such, which also meant a turn away from the Black Belt thesis and Black self-determination. And so that was one moment. The second moment is after the so-called Khrushchev revelation. So this is 1956. There was a second wave. So people like Doxy Wilkerson, a Black communist, left the party because of, this revelation of what are called like Stalinist atrocities, right? And so that was like another mass exodus. Also by that time, according to Harry Haywood, who was expelled in 1957, there was a lot of feds in the party at that time, because we know that what ultimately morphed into COINTELPRO came from, I think it's called Common Form. So it was a COINTELPRO like program to infiltrate the Communist Party and to decimate the Communist Party, which they did, not through the sort of Smith Act trials, as well as that sort of counterintelligence program. So I think that those are two moments of large Black exodus. But there are a lot of like Black people who stayed in the party, so or who didn't formally leave but might have backed away. So Esther Cooper Jackson is one. I think she was still formally in the party but started to do other types of work. But her husband James Jackson stayed. You had Henry Winston stayed in the party. Pettis Perry was still in the party. So there were many Black people who did remain after that mass exodus. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It also makes, as you were asking it and Charisse was answering, it also made me start thinking about the kind of broader communist movements in the 60s and 70s, and then the influence of Mao and Maoist groups and the general anti-colonial movement. And then when we keep that in mind, and we don't have just this fixation like that we have here on the CP milieu, then the connection between Black movements and communist movement gets a lot broader. And I think really, productive and useful. Like I think this history is crucial to put the other history in context. So it's not only like that version, but that when this one falls away, there are others that take it that start to take its place that can be useful too.
Yeah, the new left. So there's still a bunch of these new left folks who are like Marxist Leninists or Maoists, maybe Trotskyists, mostly Marxist Leninists or Maoists, and then also who also are sort of or probably self-identified as such, but through support of like the African Liberation Support Committee, through support of like anti-colonial struggles that are happening in Vietnam and in Southern Africa. And so, but there is a move, I think, away just from the CP. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. Please join me in thanking Charisse Burden-Stelly and Jody Dean. Thank you all for coming and for wonderful questions. Much obliged. We hope to see as many of you as possible on Thursday. And good luck to you all.